What will happen to your debt when the dollar finally meets its inevitable end? Because debt is a legal contract that is denominated in a very specific number of dollars. So how is everything handled when those dollars are no longer being used, once another currency has taken its place? Considering this question, is it possible that you might be able to take advantage of an inflationary debt jubilee by loading up on debt in anticipation of a hyperinflationary collapse? If you don't have to pay it back, you win, the lender gets screwed. However, if it gets repriced in the new currency and you do have to pay it back, then you get screwed out of purchasing power and the lender wins. Luckily, we are not flying blind into a hyperinflationary abyss. Hyperinflation and currency failures and currency changes have happened hundreds of times all across the world with different cultures, different governments, different times of history, different levels of technology. So we have a good idea of how this stuff plays out in reality. And the first thing to understand is that not all debts are created equal, and not all debts will die the same death. The typical American is going to have three types of debt. They're going to have the mortgage on their home, they're going to have a loan on their car, and they're going to have some credit card debt. Yes, there are going to be other types of debt that are very common, like personal loans and student loans, but these three span the spectrum well enough that if we focus on what would happen with these three types of debt, we get a good idea of what would happen with any type of debt. So first, we're going to look at credit card debt. In short, credit card debt will ruin you. And to be honest, that's whether or not we get deflation or inflation. Credit card debt is not a good idea. It will crush you. And no, just to be clear, I'm not talking about having a credit card, using it to pay your bills, paying off that balance every single month. That's not credit card debt. What I'm talking about is maintaining credit card debt, having a balance that you carry over and you're making payments on it, whether it's the minimum payment or more. In 2022, the average credit card balance was $5,900. And in 2023, new stats are showing that 33% of Americans think they won't be able to get out of credit card debt for 2 years. And a survey from Inside 1031 found that over half of Americans carry a monthly credit card balance, which again is not paying it off every month. That's carrying a balance, over half. So why is this so dangerous? Because inflation causes unregulated interest rates to soar. If I'm going to be loaning you money, I need to be compensated for the risk that I'm taking on, the risk of not getting paid back. And so that's what the interest rate is. I'm going to charge you interest on that. Now, if the debt is backed up by something, there's collateral on it. I loan you money, and if you don't pay back, I can get something from you. I can get the collateral, then there's less risk for me, so I can charge you a low rate. A credit card debt is unsecured. There is no collateral. So if you default, I can't come after your car or your house. So the risk on that is higher, so I'm going to charge a higher interest rate on that. So we're already starting off with the highest rate debt in town. But now when we factor in inflation, we have to factor in the loss of purchasing power that the lender is receiving. For instance, with a 10% inflation rate, every year, my purchasing power goes down by 10%. So if I give you money and you give me the same number of dollars back, I still lose 10%. So now my baseline is 10%. So I'm adding on a high interest rate for unsecured credit card debt on top of the baseline rate, which would be close to inflation in this example, 10%. This also means that if inflation continues to tick up higher and higher, then credit card rates will continue to tick up higher and higher, which will leave many people in a death trap of credit card debt where they can no longer ever have the possibility of getting out of that credit card debt because they'll never be able to pay it off. Every month they're paying more dollars, but they can barely afford their minimum payment. That minimum payment keeps on going up just because the interest rate is going up. They're not making a dent on their principal. This is actually taking place right now. If you take a look at interest rates on credit cards right now, in February of this year, they just ticked up to a new all-time high record of 20%. So even today's inflation, which is mild compared to hyperinflation, is already starting to get people trapped in credit card debt, where they will not be able to get out of it because the interest rate is so high. And if inflation moves higher into even hyperinflation, it will absolutely trap anybody with a balance because these rates can go to anything that they want. 20%, 50%, 100%. At the end of the day, what this will cause is people to just default on their credit card debt, because if you look at that and think, well, no matter what, I'm never going to be able to get out of this, and I can't afford my other bills, so I'm not going to pay that. And ultimately, that's the end of debt like this, is that everybody defaults on it. You also don't have any new borrowers coming in, because with interest rates at 100% or more, you're not going to have anybody taking on that risk to get that new debt. So a hyperinflationary collapse of a currency would cause credit card debt to dry up. It would cease to exist. All the existing borrowers would default, and all of the new borrowers would cease borrowing. And no, this particular type of sweeping debt default would not actually tip things over into deflation, because credit card debt is not a very large asset considering the global financial system. So defaults of all credit card debt would not have a substantial enough impact on the balance sheets of banks and financial institutions to cause them to be at risk of closing down. Yeah, there'd be some companies that would go out of business, maybe like Capital One or other heavily credit card focused companies. But for the most part, this isn't going to be enough to move the needle to drop down the total amount of money in circulation. These defaults would just put some people out of business. So credit cards are the example of adjustable rate debt. Basically, no matter what kind of debt it is, no matter what you buy with it, if it's adjustable rate debt, it will crush you, it will destroy you, and it's a bad idea no matter deflation or inflation. Stay away. But the next example is auto loans, and this is going to lie somewhere on the middle of the spectrum for most people. At the end of 2022, Americans accumulated $1.52 trillion in auto loan debt, bringing the average auto loan amount to about $42,000. And as of March of 2023, the average interest rate on a 48-month new car loan hit up to 7.5%, with almost 17% of consumers buying a car with an auto loan committing to a payment of $1,000 or more, which is probably the stupidest financial decision for 90% of those people that they will ever make in their life. But the question is not whether or not those car purchases are dumb. The question is, what will hyperinflation do to that debt? The fact is that most auto loans, at least in the United States, are fixed rate debt, which means that you will owe, by the end, a specific number of dollars, the principal plus the interest at the end, no matter what. That interest rate will not change. You know exactly the number of dollars you owe back. The underlying asset, it's a liability, that car, terrible in reality. It's going to cost you money in gas and insurance and maintenance. It's going to break, it's going to fall apart, it's going to depreciate, it's going to lose value. It is not going to be something that will increase in value over its life. But again, that's not the question here. What happens to the debt? Well, something funny happens during inflation to the money. The money becomes more abundant. We've all seen the price of eggs, the price of Uber Eats, the price of gas, the price of eating out, the price of rents. But one other thing has gone up in cost as well: wages. As the money supply grows, the incomes for Americans also grow. They definitely don't grow as much or as fast as the inflation of goods and services, but that's not the point. The point is that wages do go up. As the money works its way through the economy, it bids up the price of everything, including incomes. Another way of explaining this is that when something becomes more abundant, its cost goes down. So when money becomes more abundant, the cost to acquire that money goes down. Less hours are needed today to get $10 than the hours you would have needed to get $10 10 years ago. For example, my very first job, I was working at a movie theater, sweeping the floors, picking up the trash. I got paid $7.25 per hour. I worked for months to get a raise, to get a promotion so I could get behind the concession counter and scoop popcorn for people. I got a raise to $7.35 per hour, a whole 10 cents. That's right, I felt rich. Not really. The point is, the other day I was driving through the drive-thru at In-N-Out and I looked at the sign hanging on the window and it said, now hiring $20 an hour to flip burger patties. Now, they're the best burgers in the world, so I think they're worth it. They're doing something right there. But my first job was $7.25 an hour. It is less costly today to get $7 than it was when I first started working. Today you work for an hour, you can get 3 sets of $7. $21. Back then you work for an hour, you could only get $7. It would take 3 hours to get the same $21. So in hyperinflation, that trend is amplified. It becomes less and less and less costly. You have to give less labor, less goods, less services in order to get the same number of dollars. So right now, maybe you need an entire year's worth of labor to get $100,000. With enough inflation, maybe you only need a few months of work to get $100,000. Now, definitely that means everything else becomes more expensive as well. Everything that is, except one thing: fixed rate debt. Today, you owe $40,000 on that car. That's your principal plus your interest. That dollar amount won't change. If inflation pushes the price of everything up, it also pushes up the price of wages, and then that $40,000 gets easier to acquire in the future than it is today. That means in 4 or 5 years from now, if we experience hyperinflation, maybe you only need to do a side hustle in order to get enough cash to pay off that debt. Heck, maybe you even only need to sell a dozen eggs to be able to pay off that entire car loan. At that point, you have no more debt and you still have the car. That car is a worse car than it was before. It's beaten up, it's gotten into a few fender benders, but it's still a car and you've got no debt. This is an example of a wealth transfer, how inflation causes wealth to be transferred from the lender to the borrower. When the money is printed and it becomes more abundant, it makes all the existing dollars worth less. And so in the future, when you gather up those extra dollars that are worth less, you don't have to pay back more dollars. Fixed rate debt means you only owe back a specific number of dollars. You're borrowing dollars that are worth more and paying back dollars that are worth less. At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, well, all this so far is what happens to your debt during inflation, not what happens once the currency actually fails. And don't worry, we are going to get to that. I will address that. But take a look at this chart. This is the chart of the inflation rate in Venezuela. Now, it's hard to see because this chart is not a log chart, it is linear, but there was really high inflation in 2016, 2017, 2018, and it blew up off the charts, but even during 2018, that's an entire year and a half before it got up to these crazy high levels. The point is, even in the worst hyperinflationary episodes in world history, these things do not happen overnight. Okay, there's one type of debt we have not looked at yet. We've looked at adjustable rate debt, which is a death trap. It kills you no matter which way we go. We've also looked at fixed rate debt that you use to buy something that's not an asset. So this is fixed rate debt by itself. Basically, it's a dumb idea, but at least you come out a little bit further ahead. With adjustable rate debt, you just get crushed. So what if you use the fixed rate debt to buy an asset? Like a home, like a mortgage on a personal residence. Or even better, what if you use fixed rate debt to purchase a cash flowing asset, something like a rental property or a small business? The first thing to note is that all the same from before applies about how money works, inflation works, how money becomes more abundant. It costs less to get your hands on that new money. It becomes easier to pay that off because wages and incomes go up. It just gets easier to get your hands on new dollars. Through hyperinflation, you sell a couple dozen eggs and now you have enough to pay off the entire mortgage. But if you've used fixed rate debt to purchase an asset, something is happening to that asset as well. The price of that asset is going up. Just like the cost of eggs and wages, the price of that house is also increasing, just like we saw in 2020 and 2021. Now, you're probably right now thinking, wait a second, no, we did see stocks and real estate go up in 2020 and 2021, but by the time inflation got here, all those assets stopped going up in price. So what do you mean inflation causes everything to go up? Well, first of all, that's an error in defining inflation as just the prices of goods and services going up. But when you see asset prices going up, like stocks and crypto and real estate, and then eventually you see prices of goods and services and wages going up, what you're noticing is inflation across the board. It just happens in phases. When new money gets printed, first it hits asset prices. Those are the first things to respond. Everybody buys those assets in anticipation of all the new money flooding into the system. And then eventually, as assets get sold and paychecks go up and bonuses get paid out, and it's more of like, this is like a trickle-down effect, the real trickle-down effect. Really what you see is then that money hits the real economy and bids up the prices of goods and services after the assets have already gone up. Then after goods and services get more expensive, people demand higher wages to afford the higher cost of living, and and then incomes go up at the end. And so it's not all going to happen universally, constantly, everywhere, all at the same time. It's going to happen in phases, starting in assets, then goods and services, then wages. So money printing, aka the original definition of inflation, does make real estate go up. This means if you buy an asset like a home with fixed rate debt, you are getting a double whammy here. Number one, the debt is evaporating from the inflation. You could sell a couple dozen eggs to pay off your mortgage eventually, like they did in the Weimar Republic in Germany. But at the same time, the asset price is going up in value. So somebody else purchased this asset for you. You then get to pay them back at really low or real no cost to yourself, and you still have the asset that is becoming worth more in terms of purchasing power. You could then liquidate the asset to pay off that debt and be left with purchasing power left over. Or if it's a cash flowing asset like a rental property, small business, you can keep the asset and allow the cash flow to pay off your debt for you. The crazy thing about this is that the cash flow from that asset will go up during inflation as well. If eggs go from $2 a dozen to $20 a dozen and rent goes from $2,000 a month to $20,000 a month, your adjustable or your fixed rate mortgage does not change. You still owe the same number of dollars. How easy would it be to pay off that mortgage if rents go up to $200,000 a month? You pay off that mortgage in a few months. So first, adjustable rate debt kills you no matter what. Fixed rate debt, if you use it to buy something that's not an asset, then that fixed rate debt will get easier to pay off over time through high inflation. But it's not necessarily a smart idea. The third thing though is if you use fixed rate debt to purchase an asset, especially a cash flowing asset, you're getting double whammy or a triple whammy there, making out on all sides. The debt evaporates from inflation, the asset price goes up, and then the cash flow from the asset pays for your debt and continues to increase. So finally, what happens if the currency fails and you still have debt? The currency collapses, people are no longer using it, and you still owe some of that old currency. Well, let's walk through this one step at a time. Ask yourself these questions. Number one, how bad would it be for you if today you had debt and you owed 1 million continentals? Or how about what if you owe 1 million Iraqi dinar? Or how about this one? What if you owe 1 trillion Zimbabwe dollars? Basically, the point is that that debt may still exist by the time the currency stops getting used. Most of it will get paid off, but if it does still exist, it doesn't really matter at that point. The reason the old currency is no longer being used is because nobody wants it anymore. And so the cost of acquiring whatever you owe in that old currency is essentially zero at that point. That is the definition of the currency failing. You could get basically an infinite number of the old units of that old currency at almost zero cost. And by the time you get there, all lenders have stopped lending. This is the chart of interest rates in Venezuela. You can see during their inflation, interest rates hit 30, 40, 50, even almost 60%. Nobody's borrowing at those rates. And in the Weimar Republic in Germany, with their hyperinflation, their interest rates at one point hit 9% per week. That's an annual total of 7,950%. Again, nobody's borrowing at those rates. So there's no, after inflation and hyperinflation gets going, there's no new debt being created. There's just people paying off the old debt. Once the currency fails, a new currency always replaces the old one. Sometimes it is backed up by gold, sometimes it's backed up by silver, but a new form of money will always start to be used. At this point, the government has two choices because usually it is the government setting up a new money. They can say, hey, we're gonna make a new fiat currency and we're gonna just dictate the exchange rate from the old one to the new one. And essentially, if they choose this route, nothing has changed. All that's changed, it's basically like them just taking the old dollar bill that had, 10 zeros on it and lopping off all the zeros. Nothing has changed. But the government can take the market route and say, hey, look, on the black market, parallel market, everybody, you've stopped using our old money and we see that it's worth, 1 trillion of these is worth, one of the new ones. So we'll accept the market rate. And if the government goes along with the market rate, usually saying, hey, this is how much gold we have, we're going to back up the currency with this much gold, and we just don't have that much. And so we're going to go along with what the people are asking for. Then the people will then say, okay, yes, we'll use the new money. So basically the government is forced to accept the free market forces, use whatever money the people have already started using at the rate the people are using it at, Otherwise, when they don't, history shows every time they try and do this, the new money fails almost as quickly as the last one did. Which means that at that point, the hyperinflation turns into basically a giant debt jubilee. And what about repricing? Let's say you still owe, the equivalent of today's 100 grand in debt. You might be concerned that when the new money gets reinstated as the official currency, that you will owe 100,000 of the new dollars, even though it would only be worth, $1 given the exchange rate. That they would just say, whatever you owed in the old dollars, you now owe that same number in the new dollars. Now, this is possible, but it's unlikely for one reason. You have to look at the incentives for the people in power making this decision. So are the people who would be deciding this, are they lenders or are they borrowers? Because inflation and a debt jubilee is a wealth transfer from lenders to borrowers. And so if you just go with the old legal contracts and don't enforce new legal contracts and void the old ones by saying, hey, now instead of owing 100,000 of the old dollars, you now owe 100,000 of the new dollars. If you don't do that, who wins? The borrowers. Who are the biggest borrowers today? Yes, that would be the United States government. So it's possible, but given the fact that the people in power are the ones who would stand to benefit the most from letting this debt get wiped out, it's probably not very likely, especially considering the unpayable debt load is what caused the inflation to happen in the first place. And by reimposing that new debt load, they may wind up in the same position they were in before. So please keep in mind that I'm certainly not recommending anybody get into any amount of debt with this. Number two, I'm also not saying that it is guaranteed that we do go through hyperinflation. In fact, I actually think that we have a much higher likelihood of experiencing severe deflation long before we experience any high or hyperinflation. But in the case that we do experience high inflation or a hyperinflationary collapse of the dollar, this is what would happen to debt. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.